So here I have an installation of SharePoint Backup. What you're looking at right now is the SharePoint Backup console. This is the console. I mean, you can see in the bottom left, we've got these three different nodes: Farm Backup Restore, Granular Restore, and Configuration. For today's session, since we're focused on architecture, I'm just going to kind of go through the different pieces and look at each one. Then we can kind of deep dive as time permits. We should see a list of the servers in our farm on the left and some information on the right as to what's been backed up, et cetera, et cetera. We're not going to go too deep into the actual nuts and bolts of doing things. I just want to show you the tool and show you the components. But at least you can see here, so all the snazzy reds and yellows and greens, right? So on the left, I see that my farm consists of a server called Sharepoint 2013A and a server called SQL. This is the management console. This is the UI piece where we're going to see everything. If I select some nodes in here, we'll start to see all the different available information. As you can see here, I've got some completed backups that I've been doing over the course of several weeks. And again, to reiterate, each one of these statuses here represents a record within our repository database. Our repository database obviously lives over here on the SQL server. And just to point out, that repository database can really go on any SQL Server instance you want, as long as there's access to it in the network. I happen to put mine on my SharePoint SQL Server just to keep things concise for the purposes of illustration. But in a truly distributed environment, you know, you could have a dedicated SQL server for your repository, a dedicated app server for your management service, and then all the SharePoint servers hosting backup services. And then even another workstation where the UI is, right, where the console lives. So you can really distribute it out as much as you like. So if I go to databases, I should see in here a database called Metalogix Backup Repository. Now I've got a couple in here because I've got a couple of different environments and farms that I'm working with, but this is the one that's associated with this SharePoint 2013A installation. As indicated in preferences, bam. Right? So there's the UI, there's the database, the management service. In this particular installation, as we look at the very bottom left of our console, we see that we're connected as account to management service on SharePoint 2013A. So my management service actually lives right here on this very SharePoint server. And that's him right there. Again, he could have been on any dedicated application server I like. I just happen to be hosting him on this SharePoint server. The servers in my farm are SharePoint 2013A and SQL, so those two servers should also host a SharePoint backup service. This is the workhorse servers, the service that actually does the work. Again, these could be, again, the management service didn't have to be here, it just happens to be. The backup service is just any server in the farm. And if we go back over to SQL, which is my SharePoint SQL server, we'll notice that I also have one there, SharePoint backup service. And when I say servers in the farm, I'm literally talking about servers as listed in Central Admin under servers in this farm. And I'll try to get to that real quick. If I can find my Central Admin. Let's do it the right way, right? And again, just to clarify, you can always know where your what management service you're currently connected to at the bottom left of the console. And you can always find out what repository you're connected to by going to Tools, Preferences, Management Service, and seeing it there. You can also, incidentally, test that connection there. That's good food for thought. So in Central Administration, this should look familiar, 2013 Central Admin. System settings, managed servers in this farm. This list, with the exception of unconfigured or mail servers, this list represents the servers that must host a backup service. In next week's demonstration, when we actually go through the installation, we'll see how that information is populated and how we go through, quote unquote, discovering those items and rolling out to those different servers, right? But for the sake of our discussion today, just note whatever servers are listed here, those servers must host backup services, and that's exactly the case for me. Okay? So that said, I mean, that's basically where everything lives. Let's just poke around a little bit in the console just to familiarize ourselves with what goes where. I know we touched on some concepts like the backup location, etc. So if I go to my tools preferences, and again, in next week's session, we're going to build all this from scratch. So don't worry if it doesn't make much sense how I'm getting to things, or if it doesn't, if you're not familiar with the whys and hows of all this. Next week we're going to do it. But just to review our preferences tab here, note here under backup service, I've got these two locations identified, backups and backups 2. If I edit here, or if I wanted to add a new one, as you can see, we're just literally giving it a friendly name, identifying that it is going to be a UNC path, and then providing a network share. And I'm going to emphasize share. And by share, I mean a properly shared out UNC path. In other words, if I'm on C and I look in backups and go to properties, that guy is absolutely shared, right? It's not a $ hidden path or an administrative share. I mean, it would take that. Don't get me wrong. But when it gets to the mount operation, we really need to have a network share. And those reasons are all tied to SQL Server. We're going to get into a lot of detail about that in the final session. But at any rate, as you can see, I've got a network path shared out. It's shared to, I think, everyone, but primarily this account, which happens to be the account that my backup service is running as. Because at the end of the day, the backup service has to be able to get to this share and read and write to it, right? Because we're backing up data and then writing it to this location. So if I go to that location, I will see backup sets. So for instance, test for demo in here consisted of the WSS_content database. It's the only component I backed up in this particular backup. Whereas in test backup, it looks like the same database. But there are a bunch of different components we can back up. I happen to back up a database there. In the backup set itself, it looks like this. So we've got information from the primary backup service. In this case, we didn't do any backups from that particular backup service location, so there's nothing in there. Information from the SQL server. As you can see here, we've got some archived data files. These are literally database data files, an MDF and an LDF, but compressed and archived into our proprietary PB format. And then additionally, we have a bunch of component metadata information. This is XML and .pb data that represents metadata about this backup data, particularly relevant to volume shadow copy. Not to get too far into it, but volume shadow copy has its own definitions for what components live where, and that's what we're leveraging to identify components to back up. So we package up information from VSS in the backup set as well. But that's really basically it. It's basically just compressed files of the components we backed up and then metadata about those backed up components. And then a directory for each one of those. We'll talk more about this folder in the final session. Notice that I've also got a native SQL Server .bak backup file here. We'll talk about that in the final session as well. But just as a quick precursor, we can totally restore from native SQL backups. So that's why I've got one there. We'll show that in the final session. From there, just to show it, if I go to the backup tab here, with any server selected on the left, but these are the components that are exposed to us from volume shadow copy that we have the opportunity to back up. So I was backing up content databases from the SQL server. Notice also that I have access to search indexes, search server databases, and service application databases. And then on the non-database WFE application search server, we have potentially some search index files, and then a bunch of OS level components, things like IIS configuration, SharePoint Hive, web application routes, et cetera, and those represent, essentially just nuts and bolts for a SharePoint farm configuration. At the end of the day, the most important data you're ever going to back up in your farm is obviously the content itself, right? These content databases, the data that's actually living out there in SharePoint. But content is only part of the picture. It's only 80% of the puzzle. There's a lot of other configuration data and quote-unquote nuts and bolts data in SharePoint itself, and we can back those up too. The backup of these is really more from the disaster recovery perspective. A DR strategy would necessitate we have all this stuff backed up, obviously. For the purposes of being able to restore granular content, we really only care about content databases. That's the components we're leveraging to get granular restoration. We'll talk more in detail about that in the final session as well. So if we go back to our preferences real quick. So we talk about the backup locations. Again, we're going to build these out from scratch in next week's meeting. If we look at the management service, we have some information here about the repository database, where it lives. We can change this if needed. How often we're grooming. As you can see in my case, I'm deleting backup sets from the repository and disk, i.e. backup set location, after 14 days. So anything that's 15 days or older will get deleted every morning at 5 a.m. All right? We can also choose to retain a specific number of log files, if and only if you have specific restraints in terms of file size on your file system. Our data files for logs are by default capped at 10 megabytes. When we roll over and create a new file after 10 megs, you can limit that if you want. On the console side, this is pretty, simple stuff. How quickly do we automatically refresh status on the UI, et cetera, et cetera. Beyond that, just to dig into a couple of the other things real quick. Obviously, we can back up stuff from here. We do have a Restore tab in the Farm Backup Restore view. This is for restoring at the highest level. Restoring from this context means I'm restoring the entire database back to where it came from, right? This is not granular restore. This is restoring at the disaster recovery scope. An entire database got wiped out, or a database server got wiped out. This is where you restore that stuff. I can also schedule backups or review scheduled backups in this view. As you can see, I've got an Academy schedule set up to go every week on Sunday at midnight, and then I have differentials scheduled to go every weekday through Saturday at midnight. There's a little bit more information here. I'm saving those backup sets to this file location. I'm using this account to run the backup, et cetera, et cetera. The alerts view gives us quick, I don't have any alerts because nothing's failed for me. Currently, my alerts are set to give me information if and only if things fail or warn. If I had successful checked here, I'd definitely see alerts in this view. And the operation queue represents things that are currently occurring. If I kick off a backup right now, I'd see a node in the operation queue giving me the status of that backup job. On the granular restore side, we won't look too deep into this, but this is the view we'd look at if we're wanting to actually mount a database and restore granular content. And when I say granular content, I mean sites, site collections, lists, libraries, documents within libraries. So we can really restore all the way down to a single document from a backup of a complete database. So that's kind of fun and interesting, and we're going to look at that in more detail in the later sessions. And the last bit to look at here is the configuration view. This is an oft overlooked and really important view that gives us an indication of what's out there in the field and how things are communicating. So as you can see, right off the bat on the left, I see two green arrows next to these two nodes, indicating I do have a backup service on 2013A, and I do have components on SQL. If I look on the right, I can see quite a bit of information actually. In blue, I see SharePoint backup components on those individual servers and their status online. I also see, however, some information from SharePoint services that are online or running, which may or may not be useful to you from the context of SharePoint backup, but we definitely show it. The most important thing, though, is to see that the SharePoint backup components are online and installed and operational. And if they weren't, we'd have the opportunity to either install them or upgrade them or start them and stop them, et cetera, et cetera. The only other bit I would mention in this kind of overview would be A, self-service recovery. We can deploy automatically from this view or from right here. Now I've already got it deployed, but if we go into SharePoint system settings, manage farm solutions, we should see MetaLogic's SSR Solution 2013 WSP. Currently have it in the solution store, but not deployed. For those of you who are familiar with deploying solutions, it's a two-phase process. Phase 1, get it into the solution store. Phase 2, deploy it to the web applications you plan to use it on. We actually do that from the tool. Like if I selected repair right now, it would go through that motion via this UI. Maybe you don't want to do that, or maybe you have some situation that might block you from doing it remotely. We can always go to our program files directory, identify the WSP in question, and then take that where we want and use PowerShell or STS-ADM, whatever means you prefer, to manually roll out that solution. It's just a SharePoint farm solution just like any other, right? But we do package in a nifty little UI-based remote deployer. Beyond that, license management is pretty standard for most MetaLogic's tools. We have an activation concept. You know, you pop that in, you activate online, and it kicks off. SharePoint backup licensing is based on the number of servers hosting backup services. So at the basic level, every server in your farm, that number will represent the primary number for your licenses. If you plan to host mounted databases on a dedicated SQL server, that SQL server would also need a backup service, so you have to factor that in as well. But for the most part, primarily, we're just counting servers that host a backup service. And by default, that should be every server within your farm as listed under Central Admin. Hope that makes some sense.